What would you choose as your final meal if you knew tomorrow you'd die at the hands of the state? Picture it, steel doors slamming shut, the echo of footsteps in a cold, fluorescent hallway, and the clock ticking down to the moment where there's no turning back. For Glen Edward Rogers, the man the world came to know as the Casanova Killer, that choice was as unsettling as his very last words. But here's the part that still divides people to this day. What happened inside Florida's death chamber that night wasn't just an ending, it became one of the most controversial executions in the state's history. And tonight, you're about to find out why. Glen Edward Rogers wasn't the kind of man who drew suspicion at first glance. He was tall, smooth-talking, with a smile that could disarm you in seconds. The kind of man you might bump into at a bar, share a drink with, maybe even trust enough to give a ride home. But behind that easy charm was a storm brewing, one that left bloodstains across multiple states. They called him the Casanova Killer because he lured women in with promises of affection, only to leave them lifeless, their families shattered, their names etched into the long, grim history of American crime. These weren't nameless faces in the dark. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, ordinary people who thought they were safe, right up until the moment they weren't. And yet, Glen wasn't content with the horrors already tied to his name. From his prison cell, he whispered of secrets far more shocking, hinting that he knew details about a murder case so infamous it shook the nation in the 1990s. Was he telling the truth, or just feeding his ego, desperate to be remembered for more than the lives he destroyed? Because here's the unsettling truth, Glen Edward Rogers looked like any other man, laughed like any other man, but behind that smile was something monstrous. Something the world didn't see coming, until it was too late. Glen Edward Rogers' story doesn't begin in a courtroom or on death row. It begins in the shadows of a broken home in Hamilton, Ohio. Born in 1962, the youngest of 7 children, Glen grew up in an environment where survival came before innocence. His childhood was a cocktail of poverty, violence, and neglect. His father was an alcoholic who disappeared for long stretches, his mother left struggling to keep the family afloat. By the time most kids were learning to ride bikes and throw baseballs, Glen was already learning how to lie, how to fight, and how to take what didn't belong to him. As he grew, so did his temper. Neighbors remembered him as unpredictable, sweet one moment, explosive the next. By his teenage years, run-ins with the law had already begun. He dropped out of school, drifted in and out of trouble, and soon earned a reputation as a con man who could talk his way into almost anything, or out of it. But it wasn't just petty theft or small-town fights that defined him. Glen discovered something darker inside himself. He realized he could use his good looks and easy smile as weapons. He could walk into a bar, flash a grin under the dull glow of neon lights, and leave with the attention of women who never suspected the danger seated across from them. In the early 1990s, his drifting lifestyle turned deadly. From Ohio to Kentucky, from Louisiana to Florida, women began turning up dead. Some were found in dingy motels, the sheets still stained with blood. Others were discovered in their own homes, where the faint smell of cigarettes hung in the air long after he vanished. No one connected the dots at first. To police in each city, they looked like isolated tragedies, random acts of violence that couldn't possibly trace back to the same man. But a pattern was forming, one terrifying in its consistency. The women Glen targeted often looked similar, petite, vulnerable, often met through chance encounters. He charmed them, gained their trust, and then struck with shocking brutality. Strangulation, stabbing, beatings, it didn't matter. What mattered to him was control. The thrill of watching life drain from someone who moments earlier had believed they were safe in his company. And still, he kept moving. One state, then another. A drifter with no real ties, leaving chaos in his wake. Police struggled to keep up, different jurisdictions meant different detectives, different cases, none realizing how wide the web truly stretched. It wasn't until Glen slipped up, leaving behind a trail of witnesses, DNA, and the chilling similarities in his methods, that the threads began to tie together. By then, the FBI and local authorities were piecing together something horrifying. This wasn't just a dangerous man, this was a serial killer. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Because for Glen Edward Rogers, the women he killed weren't enough. From his prison cell, he began to speak about another murder, one that didn't belong to him, or maybe it did. A case that had already captivated America, one where guilt and innocence were still debated in every bar, living room, and courtroom across the country. And yet, these murders were just the beginning, because Glen Rogers would go on to claim knowledge of a killing far more notorious. When the pieces finally started falling into place, detectives realized Glen Edward Rogers had been playing a deadly game across state lines. In Florida, investigators connected him to the brutal murder of Tina Marie Cribbs, a young mother who had gone out for what seemed like an ordinary night. Eyewitnesses recalled seeing her with a man who fit Rogers' description, a charming stranger with piercing eyes. Hours later, Tina was found dead in a motel room, her body left behind as though she were nothing more than discarded evidence of his passing through. In California, the pattern repeated. Another woman, another night out, another brutal killing. Blood on the carpet, the faint trace of Glen's DNA in places he thought he'd wiped clean. And in Kentucky, his home state, yet another victim tied back to him by the same haunting blueprint, trust followed by betrayal, life followed by death. Detectives from different jurisdictions began comparing notes. The puzzle grew clearer. Rogers wasn't just a drifter. He was a predator. His face appeared on wanted posters, his name whispered in briefing rooms across the country. The FBI issued bulletins. His movements, once hidden in the anonymity of cheap motels and roadside bars, were now under a nationwide spotlight. And then came the twist no one saw coming. Behind bars, awaiting trial, Glen Rogers began writing letters, confessions of sorts. In one, he claimed responsibility for a crime far beyond his own bloody trail, the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman in Los Angeles. The very murders that had put O.J. Simpson on trial in what became one of the most watched court cases in American history. Glen insisted he had been hired to steal jewelry from Nicole's home, and that things had gone wrong. He described details of the crime scene, some vague, some eerily specific. It was enough to make people wonder, was he simply boasting to inflate his dark legacy, craving attention in the shadow of a trial that had captivated millions? Or, was there something more to his words? Did investigators miss a thread that could have rewritten one of the most controversial verdicts of the 20th century? That question still lingers. And it's one that splits opinions to this day. Because while police worked tirelessly to convict Glen for the murders they could prove, the whispers of what he claimed about O.J.'s case continue to cast a long, unsettling shadow over his story. When Glen Edward Rogers was finally captured, it wasn't the face of a hardened criminal that the cameras showed to the world. It was the same easy grin, the same calm charm that had once lured his victims in. But behind that grin, investigators knew, was a man with blood on his hands from one end of the country to the other. In Florida, prosecutors brought him to trial for the murder of Tina Marie Cribbs. The courtroom became a stage, every detail of her final hours laid bare before the jury. Witnesses described seeing Rogers with her in that Tampa bar, walking out together into the night. The motel clerk remembered his face. And the physical evidence, the bloodstains, the fingerprints, told a story that no defense strategy could undo. Rogers sat quietly through much of the proceedings, sometimes smirking, sometimes staring blankly at the jurors as if daring them to look away. His lawyers argued desperation, a troubled past, even suggested mistaken identity. But the weight of the evidence crushed every excuse. The prosecution painted him as a man who preyed on kindness, who turned chance encounters into fatal traps. When the verdict came down, it landed like thunder. Guilty. And then, the decision that would seal his fate, death. For the families of the victims, the moment carried a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that the man who had stolen so much from them would never walk free again. Sorrow, because no verdict, no sentence, could bring their loved ones back. Tears filled the courtroom. Some cried for justice. Others cried because even justice felt too small compared to the pain left behind. And yet, while the courtroom had decided his fate, Glen Edward Rogers still had one last decision to make, his final meal. When you look past the verdict and the headlines, you're left with the question that lingers in every case like this: what kind of man was Glen Edward Rogers, really? Was he born a monster, or shaped into one by the chaos of his childhood? Psychologists who studied him described a man who fed on attention, who thrived on being the center of the story. His narcissism dripped from every letter he wrote, every smirk he flashed in court. He wasn't just killing for the act itself, he was killing for the thrill, for the sense of power, for the feeling that he mattered in a world where he had once been nothing. Some argued he was mentally ill, his actions driven by more than cruelty, perhaps by delusion, perhaps by something broken deep inside him. But others saw no sickness, no madness, just a man who enjoyed watching life slip away from those who trusted him. A predator who used charm as a mask, hiding the darkness that never left his eyes. And here's the part that should make you pause. America has always had a strange fascination with killers like Rogers, the ones who don't look like killers at all. We call them charismatic, we nickname them Casanova, we turn their trials into television events. And in doing so, we sometimes blur the line between condemning evil and feeding its legacy. Was Glen Edward Rogers a man to be studied, or a man who simply shouldn't be remembered at all? Then there's the question of justice. His death sentence was carried out in the name of closure, in the name of deterrence. But does execution truly stop another Glen Rogers from being born? Does it heal the pain of families who still set a place at the table that will forever stay empty? Or does it simply move the story from the courtroom to the death chamber, leaving us debating what justice really means? Did his execution bring closure, or did it leave more questions than answers? On the night of his execution, Glen Edward Rogers was led into Florida's death chamber. The air inside was heavy, the kind of silence that presses against your chest. Witnesses sat quietly, waiting to hear the last words of a man who had once charmed his way into the lives of so many, only to take those lives away. His final meal had been delivered hours earlier. A plate of chicken, mashed potatoes, biscuits, and pie. Simple. Ordinary. Almost unsettling in its normalcy, considering the horrors tied to his name. He ate it slowly, as though savoring the one decision left entirely in his control. And then came his last words. They weren't long. They weren't profound. Some described them as unsettling, others as empty. But whatever was said in that final breath, it was clear that no string of sentences could undo what he had done, or give back what had been taken. For Glen Edward Rogers, the end came quietly. But his story continues to haunt the families who will never stop grieving, the courts that wrestled with his crimes, and anyone who wonders just how many more victims he may have left behind. So, what do you think? Did justice truly prevail, or is Glen Rogers' story proof that evil can hide in plain sight? Let us know in the comments. And if this case grips you, join us here at Final Verdict Diaries every week, where we uncover the darkest corners of crime and punishment. Hit like, share this story, and subscribe, because the final verdict is yours.